Need psychotherapy online or in person? Check out tinyurl.com/THT Psychotherapy. The George Brassey Podcast is made possible with funding provided from Brassey Global Strategies, LLC, a leading political consulting, public policy, government affairs, and research firm. Are you interested in running for elected office? Need advice? Call or email George, 708-769-5015. Brassey Global Strategies 1@gmail.com.
Before we get to the interview, I just want to tell you about our newest sponsor, Union Signs and Printing. Union Signs and Printing is a union sign shop located near Chicago, Illinois, that specializes in the production of corrugated plastic lawn signs used in applications ranging from political and election usages to unions, schools, and businesses. They also produce a vast array of other products, including American-made, union-printed t-shirts, banners, bio cards, literature, door hangers, business cards, and trifold. Get a hold of Union Signs and Printing at 815-740-1688 or find them on the internet at unionsignsandprinting.com. And don't forget to tell them you heard about their services on the George Brassey Podcast. Everyone, it's George. I'm so glad to welcome Richard Pocker to the podcast. Richard, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Richard, can you tell the listeners a little bit about who you are?
Okay, my name is Richard Pocker, and I suffered a hearing loss from scarlet fever when I was 5. I wore hearing aids until I was 30, and then I suffered a total collapse of all my hearing within 1 month. So I depended on lip reading 100% for 35 years. I received simultaneous bilateral cochlear implant surgery just before my 65th birthday, which was 7 years ago. And I went from 0 speech comprehension to 85% with rehabilitation. So that's the background of who I am. And since that time, I've worked with more than 1,000 people, helping to get them out of the isolation of hearing loss, primarily through spreading education about cochlear implants, and I do it through social media, face-to-face meetings, and seminars.
Richard, what's that experience like for you going from 5 to 35 with minimal or low hearing?
Are we talking about getting it back or losing it?
Losing it in the first place. What was it like?
When I lost it, I was 30 years old. I had a family business. I had 35 employees. I was married, a 3-year-old son, and it was total panic, so total depression. I went into a tailspin. And fortunately, I found a therapist at that time. And Bill was very interesting. He didn't have a hearing loss, but he had a death sentence from leukemia, which didn't take place. So he was very empathetic to the shock value of life's experiences when you've changed tremendously. So I stayed with Bill for about 2 years, which was very helpful. He helped me get through the initial shock.
What are some of the symptoms of hearing loss for the people?
Well, most people with hearing loss, most cases, 99% of the cases, everybody loses hearing with age, and the symptoms are very, very gradual. Eventually, you wind up saying "what" a lot, "huh" a lot. You put on a puzzled face, and the isolation begins because you can't go out with friends. Your family tends to ignore you. It's painfully isolating. Now, I've met people that just collapse completely and they withdraw. Others, the other side of the school of people who lose all their hearing and go to the deaf community, which is a whole different side of hearing loss. But for the average person, just not comprehending. Somebody will be speaking to you, you hear the voice, but you don't know what the hell they're talking about. So you sometimes you tend to bluff. You laugh at jokes when you have no idea what they're talking about, what the joke was. So those are some of the symptoms that people find when they're losing the hearing.
Can you talk a little bit about that distinction between hearing loss and the deaf community?
Okay, the difference is being the deaf community, totally deaf community, is very insular. It's changing a bit because people who were deaf were totally against cochlear implants. They consider deafness a culture. I have a problem with that definition. I find deafness to be a tragedy, not a culture. But they, for one reason or another, well, obviously because they're surrounded by people who are like them, they tend to be insular. They use sign language. They have their own method of communicating with each other. The hard of hearing community is much more scattered in a sense that interestingly enough, recently, in June, I co-founded a Facebook site with two other people, and it's called Hearing Loss: The Emotional Side. And that Facebook site grew to 1,200 people within 2 months. And one of the primary things I was surprised to find, so many people who posted said, I've never had anybody to talk to about this. I feel like this is the first time I'm able to express what my hearing loss is like. The isolation, the withdrawal. And so the Facebook site itself is grown. It's just tremendously revealing side of what the hearing loss community is like.
What is the emotional impact on a person?
I'm sorry.
What is the emotional impact on a person for losing their hearing?
The person for doing what?
What is the emotional impact on a person if they lose?
Oh, the emotional impact. Okay. The emotional impact itself is shock. A lot of it is shock and grieving. One of the things, the reason we started that site is I've had a theory for a long, long time that hearing loss is an amputation. And I was looking for therapists who were dealing with those with amputation to talk to about how they could help the hearing loss community or how they might describe it. And it was very interesting that about 2.5 years ago, I attended a seminar with a woman from the Veterans Administration. She was a foremost expert in cochlear implants for veterans. And she was talking about the fact that when a soldier suffers amputation from an IED, the improvised explosive device, they may lose a limb. They have tinnitus and they have hearing loss. And the surprising observation they made was those victims found tinnitus to be far worse than losing a limb, that the hearing loss came second. So tinnitus often accompanies hearing loss, and it's nonstop sound in your head. It's not the ear itself, it's the brain looking for stimulation.
What did you, when you learned that, how did that change your work?
How didn't it? I had to, well, because I had a business and employees, I couldn't stop. And I had to depend 100% on lip reading for those 35 years. I had to have people make phone calls for me. I couldn't use a telephone. And at that time, I also had an art publishing house. And I had to do trade shows. I had to do between 6 and 8 trade shows a year, 100% on lip reading. And I want to tell you, when you do a trade show, I'm a New Yorker. I'm a former New Yorker. I live in Florida now. But as a New Yorker, and you go to Atlanta and you have to lip read that Southern accent all day, honey, I would go back to my hotel room exhausted. I would sit there and cry from exhaustion. Part of the issue with hearing loss is exhaustion is very, very common because you have to pay so much attention to a person's face, the facial cues, the lip reading. You can't relax. It's not like if I were driving in a car and I was deaf, I constantly had to turn my head to the right to lip read my wife while I was driving. And that's very exhausting, but I didn't know what to do. Now, when I lost my hearing, this was around 1980, cochlear implants were in their infancy. They weren't even FDA approved at the time. And I was a big fan of all kinds of music. And my wife and I had tickets to the Metropolitan Opera for New Year's Eve, things like that. And when I lost my hearing, that went out the window. I did not want to, when I heard about cochlear implants, I had the impression that the sound was mechanical. And I did not want to lose the fidelity of music. So I put off, I just did not consider a cochlear implant at the time. And I suffered for 35 years without music, but the technology had improved and I held on to the old concept. I moved to Florida, and at that time I went to Costco. I saw the hearing aid displays, and I said, well, maybe something's changed in hearing aids in 35 years. So I made an appointment for a hearing test. I get the hearing test. The guy says to me, you're deaf as a post. And I said, yeah, I know that. No problem with that. So he said, well, there's nothing we can do for you. And a few days later, I'm in the gym, and there was somebody wearing a cochlear implant. So I started a conversation. And I found out where I live in Sarasota is a medical destination for cochlear implants. So I went to get a test. And you have to be qualified. First of all, with a cochlear implant, your speech comprehension has to be below 40% wearing a hearing aid. Well, I had no hearing. You could fire a gun behind my head. I wouldn't turn around. So that was fine. I was qualified. And I went ahead and did it, a few months later. Now, the other thing is about cochlear implants themselves, you have to learn to hear again. Well, the mechanical process of a cochlear implant is sending electronic signals through an electrode array that's placed in the cochlea itself. It sounds perfectly natural, but you have to do some rehabilitation. What this did for me was took me out of isolation. I can go into a room with 200 people. I can go to a dinner for 200 people. There are certain accessories. I can lay an accessory down on the table called a mini mic. I can pick up the voices of people around me. I no longer have to worry about approaching people. I'm a very social guy, but it was very difficult when you can't hear because you never know if you're going to be able to understand the conversation. And for years, one of the things that therapists helped me with, and I think I came to the realization that I had to find ways to socialize that did not require a lot of verbalization. Well, men, I became a sportsman. Because men really have two expressions as sportsmen: nice shot and big fish. And the rest of it's a lot of grunting. So I was able to socialize on a certain level, and that helped me. But today, I can do anything. Nothing stops me anymore.
That experience of going to therapy to talk about the hearing loss, can you expound a little bit about what that was like for you as a client?
For me as a client, it was interesting because he was more of a Freudian therapist, but obviously I could not lie on the sofa and not see his face because I had to lip read. Mm-hmm. So it was the first experience for him as well. And I think what I came through with all that time was I got rid of the anger. I think when obviously being hard of hearing as a child and bullied, I learned to use my fists very young. I found that I was able to release a lot of that anger because I had no one to talk to about it. I didn't know anybody. Everybody said to me, "Do you know sign language?" I said, "Why? I don't know anybody who's deaf. Who am I going to talk to? Myself in the mirror?" So that he helped me go through some of that anger issues. I think after 2 years, one day I just said, "Guess what? You've helped me as far as I can go with you." And you may find it's uh, a common situation where somebody in therapy one day suddenly realizes, okay, it's time for me to leave and go out off on my own. That day, um, in some ways, was frightening, but very liberating at the same time, because I knew I had to make or break it on my own. I didn't have a crutch anymore. I didn't have anybody else I could talk to about it. So that was very helpful. Now, even with the new group we formed about the hearing loss, the emotional side, many of the people coming up into the site need therapy, and they know it, and they don't know where to find it. So one of the things we were hoping to do with my collaborators was to form a database of therapists who were willing to work with deafness or hard of hearing people who understood those issues. So that's still an ongoing project, because right now we've only been doing this about 2 months.
Richard, what are some things that the therapist should know from a person who lives with this issue?
I think a therapist needs to know, has to understand amputations. And I don't really see hearing loss as any different from somebody who loses another limb. Um, I'm not sure. I believe there probably are therapists who do understand grief, because grieving is a major, major part of hearing loss. It's incredible. And I'm sure there are therapists out there that are more experienced and more or less experienced with grieving than the others.
Richard, you go on to write a book. Can you talk a little bit about the book you wrote?
Okay, the book that I wrote, okay, what I did, my podcast, what I did after about 2.5 years ago, I started doing podcast interviews like this with people who were cochlear implant recipients, surgeons, audiologists, speech therapists. And the the podcast itself was not brand specific, meaning that there were three major manufacturers of cochlear implants: Cochlear, Advanced Bionics, and MED-EL. So the site was not brand specific. And it grew. I mean, it was just incredible. These people were like this podcast. I did not edit anything. I said, the problem with social media is everybody wants a 3-minute soundbite. I said, no, you can talk 20 minutes, you can talk a half hour. I don't really care. But a person who's looking for information, because the site is called Cochlear Implant Basics. It's cochlearimplantbasics.com. These are where people who are new or searching for information will come to it. And you can tell all that you want to do. Eventually, last December, I had 25 podcasts. Now, all my podcasts have transcripts because my audience can't hear. So we do I do the podcast on Zoom. I strip out the audio. I have the transcript made, and that's what's up on the site. So I took 25 of the transcripts and created the book, because many people are not on Facebook, not on the internet. The book is called Cochlear Implant Basics: What a Candidate for a Cochlear Implant Needs to Know. And this book has transcripts of those. It has some background to cochlear implants, fact sections. It has the other section, which is very important, is called rehabilitation. Once you receive a cochlear implant, you do have to learn to listen. Again, it does take time, but it's worth the result. So I did this book. I published it on Amazon in December, and I offered the Kindle edition for 99 cents, because I'm not out to make money. My mission is to get people out of the isolation of deafness. I then translated the book into 6 other languages. It's English, it's in Spanish, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, and Hindi, because that covers more than half the world's population. Now, one of the things I like about what I do as a volunteer, the company I chose was Cochlear, and I volunteer for them. But my website and my volunteer work is 24/7. I work in 24 time zones. Companies like Cochlear sell cochlear implants in more than 80 countries. So I have to understand cultural nuances. And I decided when I published a book, I would do it in at least 50% of the world's languages. And that's what I did back in December.
Richard, the last question we asked the guest here on the George Brassey podcast is, what are 2 books you would recommend to the audience that have been important to you as a person, and why?
Important to me as a person versus hearing. Well, I think the most important book I read years ago was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, because that was the book that allowed me to, I guess at the time I was still deaf back then. And part of it, I think, I guess there was a lot of self-pity involved in it. And I thought Viktor Frankl's book took me from the place where you could be in the most horrifying condition of a concentration camp and still come out to enjoy life, to understand that your circumstances are your control most of the time. How you feel about them is your control. And that started to turn me around. That's one book. The other book I love, I know it has nothing to do with hearing loss, but Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, I've always considered one of the finest books in the English language, even though the topic, some of the sentences in there are no longer culturally acceptable. But I've always admired a man whose primary language was Polish, and he wound up writing one of the greatest English stories ever, the greatest stories in English.
Richard, if the audience wanted to find you on the internet or learn more about your work, how would they do it?
Okay, they can find my website, which is cochlearimplantbasics.com. And if they're on Facebook, I have 2 Facebook sites, one being hearing loss, the emotional side, and the other one is called Bilateral CI Warrior. And that site is used for people who are considering getting a second one. Very few people who are like me, where they got 2 at the same time. Most people get 1 and then a second. So both those sites are up there. My email address is my name @gmail.com, so people can connect with me directly. richardpocker@gmail.com. I'm happy to talk to anybody, anytime. Any hearing issues, I'm available. This is what I do 24 hours a day.
Richard, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Be well.
Help George stay on the Chicago Heights City Council. Go and donate today at tinyurl.com/AldermanGeorge 2023. Need more George? Like his pages on Facebook. Friends of George Brassey PAC, 5th Ward Business Alliance, Chicago Heights Bicycle and Pedestrian Resource Center, and the George Brassey Podcast.